Hello and welcome. We are going to talk about the developments along the front line as well as strikes in the rear area, especially the one on Chernihiv. We'll talk about the activities on the Black Sea, and we obviously can't not talk about the article in the Washington Post, which more or less says that Ukraine will not be able to achieve its goals in this current counteroffensive. Has been a Russian missile strike on the town of Chernihiv, on the city of Chernihiv here. They've struck several targets, and the reports are that 7 persons were killed. From what I found, it was civilians, the reports, and 110 are wounded. We see the strike happening here, like one of the images in this regard. The Russian military bloggers claim that there were drones stored in the theater, which was among the installations hit. I saw some claims to be evidence, and so far I have to say they don't convince me, but they claim it was a military target. I'll just leave it as that. I'll just leave it at that. The Russians are also saying that there has been a drone attack by the Ukrainians on the airport of Novgorod. There is smoke in the background visible, so a fire was started, but they say the drone hit the parking lots, so I guess cars, the parking lot, that's why there is fire visible in Novgorod. Let's go to the front line. We have reports of Ukrainian attacks at Sinkivka and to the east of it. We also have reports that the Russians are continuing to attack here. There are some claims by the Russians that they advanced east of that line here, that they pushed down south here. I cannot fully confirm this, so I'm unsure about this. It seems possible, but as I said, I haven't seen convincing evidence yet that the Russians attacked further here, but we know that the Ukrainian counterattacks have failed. There is no contrary claims to this. There are also continuing attacks, continued fighting further south, Novoselivske, here on the Sherebets bridgehead, as well as in Torske, Dibrova, and the Serebryanske forest. I cannot confirm any change in territory here. South of the Seversky Donetsk, the fighting is continuing, but we have Russian claims that fighting has somewhat died down south of Bakhmut. I had a report just from today that supposedly there was a Ukrainian mechanized attack in the direction of Klishivka, but I do not see any confirmation that anything has changed whatsoever. We have the Ukrainian General Staff saying that south of Bakhmut they took new positions, that they established new positions. That should make us believe that at the very least they pushed into the contested area and established themselves there. So supposedly that they would control more area there. I have not seen visual evidence of this though, so I cannot confirm any changes here. We have reports by the Russians of Russian counterattacks at Andrivka and Klishivka, and for instance Wargonzo is saying that those Russian attacks were failing, so I cannot confirm any change at Bakhmut as well. And this is more or less again for most of the front line, the theme here. Avdiivka, we have Russian attacks in the direction of Keramik, Novokalinove. They failed. Russians are saying they captured some positions, but we do not have any confirmation. And I have the Ukrainian claims that those counterattacks were repulsed. So they might have gained something, but at least we do not see any proof of this. The Russians also attacked at Marinka and at Krasnohorivka. Attacks failed according to the Russians themselves. The Ukrainians attacked at Avdiivka and at Marinka. I cannot confirm that they have achieved anything either. Mikilske, Ukrainian attack is reported, so directly east of Vuleda, no change in territory can be documented. And at the Oblast border, it's somewhat different here south of Velika Novosilka. We have the Ukrainians actually advancing further south of Urushaine, but the advance is fairly limited. So we have geolocalizations, and as you can see, this is a small patch of trees here, and this is the tree line right south of Urushaine. So this would be here and here, where Ukrainians have been. We do not know if they've advanced further south, but we at least can confirm that they push further south from Urushaine. Other than that, we have fighting around Priutne. The Ukrainians supposedly attacked there. I cannot confirm this, but no change in territory. And the Russians have done counterattacks on Uroshaine and in the direction of Novodarivka. So I guess here north of Priutny, somewhere in this direction, or maybe here. I can't geolocalize it accurately, but even according to Russian sources, both counterattacks failed. At Orikhiv, fighting is obviously continuing, but the situation is kind of unclear. If we take visual evidence, we know that the Ukrainians were in the center of Robotine and that they were more or less aligned directly east and even a little south of Robotine. But what the current situation is unclear. When I look at Russian military bloggers, I have the full bandwidth of possibilities. One are claiming that Russian have withdrawn from Robotine, which would more or less indicate that the Ukrainians are in control of the town yet, or at least the control is partially Ukrainian controlled and partially contested. Others are saying both sides are in the town, so more or less the south is in Russian hands, the north is in Ukrainian hand, and there are others that say the Ukrainians were pushed out of Robotine. So I have no way right now of confirming the current situation. Robotine is definitely still, there's fighting around it, but whether the Ukrainians are in it deeper down, or might have been pushed out again, I can simply not confirm according to the information that I have. We know they were inside, but if they are inside still, as of now, I cannot confirm. When we talk about the Dnipro, not much change here. Lately we talked about the bridgehead west of Kosachi Lahiri. The latest information I had was that the Russians were claiming they had pushed it in. There were no Ukrainian forces on the left bank of the Dnipro anymore, whereas Ukrainian military bloggers still saw the Ukrainians being here. I have not heard from this since, so I would expect the Russians were right in this regard and the Ukrainians have withdrawn. We talked about this in the past, that unless the Ukrainians are pouring in huge amounts of troops, it seems to be more like putting a dilemma in front of the Russians to either ignore it or to push it in. But if there's only light infantry, then serious enough attack by the Russians should be able to push it in. And if that is seen, if the Ukrainians see that this attack is coming, it might make sense to withdraw. So I guess from what I see, the Ukrainians have likely withdrawn from Kosachi Lahiri west of it and are no longer on the left bank of the Dnipro. At this point now, we reach the we had Robotine, we have some geolocalizations. Apparently I missed that. Yeah, the Ukrainians were still in the northern part. We have two here where the Russians shelled Ukrainian positions here and they shelled Ukrainian positions here. So more or less here and here. At least in those parts, the Ukrainians were recently. But then again, we don't know if it's at this very moment it has changed, but if we see the artillery fire, it at least seems that the Ukrainians are probably still in the northern part of Robotine. Now we have to talk about this article that you might have heard about. Ukraine will fail to meet offensive's key goal. That doesn't necessarily mean that the offensive has failed, but at least that it won't be a complete success. If we summarize it, they say Melitopol will not be reached. And after initial heavy losses, the Ukrainians changed their tactics. They say that according to them, the Ukrainians in war games here, in joint war games, they anticipated such losses and were simply assuming that Ukraine would accept those casualties, pierce through the front lines and advance. Basically, they expected that they would lose serious amounts, but they wanted the Ukrainians to continue. The Ukrainians changed, though, and switched over to basically that attritional tactic that we heard about, and which basically puts the blame here on the Ukrainians that they didn't do what they were told. But there we obviously have to ask ourselves, did the war games simulate the extensive minefields? There is this video from Ukrainian soldiers that were trained on the Leopard 2 tank in Germany, and they ask the German trainers what they do if they encounter a minefield. And according to the Ukrainians, the response by the German tankers was, "We drive around it." Now, there is no driving around those minefields, as they seem to be almost continuous until they are breached. So we have to see, did Ukraine even receive enough? Did those assumptions, those war games, Did they account for those deep minefields? And did Ukraine receive the demining equipment it required? We know that Ukraine received less than 15% of the demining equipment they asked for. That doesn't necessarily mean they just asked for what they needed. They probably asked for a lot more, but we know they have received far less than they should have, that they wanted. The next question would be to assume that Ukrainian side will just accept the losses and march on is probably has to be put up in the context of weapon deliveries, because accepting losses is only possible if you win the war afterwards, or if you can replace those losses. And how high are the chances of additional deliveries? Ukraine will receive 31 Abrams. Where are additional orders? Where are orders for the industry to deliver existing ones? The depots for heavy weaponry outside of the US are almost empty. What is with the industry is being delivered already. There are no new orders whatsoever that are known right now for either Leopard 2 or for Abrams in regards to Ukraine. So to expect Ukraine that they just go head through and accept burning wrecks left, right, and center, but keep pushing, might be somewhat unrealistic to if it's not combined with the promise of continued deliveries to adjust for those losses. This is at least the assumption that we need to account for in this context. The other thing is we have further down, we have the Mark Milley, the US Joint Chiefs of Staff, who said that the Ukrainians were good in having attrition. What is it? How do you say? Like having the Russians receive attrition. So at least in their attritional battle, they are having some successes. And it mentions again that the US always insisted that Ukraine should focus everything in one point and push through, but Ukraine has decided differently. We have Rob Lee, which we quoted a couple of times here on the channel before, who said that the quality of the Russian defensive line has played a big role in the defensive success by the Russians as well so far. And we have the article also mentioning that there are big doubts whether the concentration of material and troops and ammunition around Bakhmut has been a good choice, as it cost a lot without achieving a lot. They are also referencing the leaked documents from February, according to which in February already the US intelligence assessment was that the Ukrainian counteroffensive will not yield big gains because they lack equipment. So hearing now complaints from the American sides or sober assessments that the Ukrainians don't achieve much, if the Americans knew half a year earlier that Ukraine doesn't have enough equipment for big successes, is kind of problematic, because the US has the biggest defense economy, the biggest depots. They would have had the biggest chance to influence the material situation of the Ukrainian side. And then we have to ask the training periods. German tankers receive years of training. There is a few months of basic training, after which you're being considered to be a driver, after which you're being considered to be a gunner. But the training continues and continues and continues to level up your skill. If the training for the Ukrainians is only for 6 to 8 weeks, and after that they are more or less pushed into the battle fairly fast, you can't expect the same results either. And that the training has been so short was a decision by the Western powers that decided not to train Ukrainian forces earlier. So far, the things are also, there could be some miracles, some bigger successes, and they might still achieve something, but the assessment is they will not reach Melitopol. Interestingly enough, though, they imply that the Ukrainians could get at least close to Melitopol. So I don't know, somewhere here maybe, which would probably still be some success, as it would increase the range for their artillery, HIMARS, etc. But the thing is, a lot of this was directly influenced by Western decisions to deliver weapons late, to deliver small amounts of weaponry, not in the full extent. For instance, the Bradleys, when the Ukrainians lost a couple of Bradleys, the US immediately delivered new ones. That begs the question, why didn't they deliver the full amount from the beginning if those were available? Things like this will have to be answered, and by forcing Ukraine to delay the counteroffensive for more or less 3/4 of a year, that gave the Russians enough time to build those fortifications where the Ukrainians run against them. So the sober assessment is that Ukraine will likely not reach the Azov Sea. I mean, that was more or less likely regarding the developments in the first weeks already. But if we look at the complaints that are being voiced, that we see that it's more or less a combination of insufficient aid by the West, as well as deficiencies on the Ukrainian side. There have been Stephen Gardy, I think, Konrad Musika, Rob Lee, and Michael Kaufman, 4 experts that were recently in Ukraine, and they, for instance, said that Ukraine still has not achieved the necessary skill in combined arms warfare, that they don't coordinate their operations. For instance, the attacks on just to give an example, if they attack south of Velika Novosilka, they don't do an attack on Orehiv at the very same time to make the Russians choose where to send their combat helicopters. Things like this show that Ukraine still has significant deficiencies in its capabilities, but at the same time, of course, the equipment needs to be mentioned as well, and this is clearly the West's decision, that they have decided to deliver less, to deliver late, and to force the Ukrainians to wait until the Russian defensive lines are established. According to those analysis, the counteroffensive has not yet failed completely, but it will not. They already say that it will not be the big success the Ukrainians had hoped for, which will also mean that the war will continue probably for a significant time longer. We have now a report from the SBU, according to which they are now revealing how they did the first attack on the Kerch Bridge, that they used 21 tons of explosives that were wrapped up with plastic to make them appear as their plastic wrap, apparently for the scanners. The details are coming out, so the Ukrainians themselves confirm now what the Russians initially said, that it was a truck bomb, not what some commenters claimed that it was ATACMS or anything like this. It was a truck bomb. The Ukrainians claim so themselves now. We have some news from the Black Sea. The Russian Ministry of Defense is saying that the 2 Russian patrol ships destroyed a Ukrainian drone that was attacking them. Riba is now mentioning that they were escorting an oil tanker, but they also claim that the drone was probably launched from the Josef Schulte, a container ship that left Odessa harbor, because the Ukrainian side have set up a corridor here allowing ships to leave Odessa that were stuck there, and the Josef Schulte was the first one leaving there, and they actually made it out without interference. And here we have Riba claiming that supposedly it's the Russian side that the Riba claiming that the Ukrainians used this to make it appear that the Ukrainians basically abused civilian ships for a military attack. We have reports here that it's not really partisan activity, but more or less intelligence. And according to the Washington Post again, Russia recruited civilians in Poland, mostly from eastern Ukraine, with online ads. And initially they started to do some propaganda stuff. And who was willing to do pro-Russia propaganda in Poland was then increasingly being paid for bigger assignments. And basically initially propaganda, then it went to espionage. They had to take pictures of certain locations, and then they had to place trackers in shipments, and they were ordered to place cameras at certain positions, so to allow the Russians to track the deliveries of weaponries to Ukraine through Poland. Right now, there are 12 Ukrainians arrested in Poland, but supposedly the Polish keep it under covers to not stir any any hatred against Ukrainian refugees, and they also arrested 1 Russian and 3 Belarusian citizens. And the article says that they also were planning to do arson and even assassination attempts in the later phase. We have a message news here from the GUR, according to which the GUR is saying that the Russians are currently mobilizing 20,000 personnel per month through crypto mobilization. They don't really pull them in completely, but they ask them to come and then force them to sign contracts. The campaign is mostly addressing migrants and freshly naturalized new citizens, basically people who just recently took the Russian citizenships. There are reports about raids in those areas where they mostly live, and that supposedly people who have not registered with the military authorities after receiving a Russian passport are this way being pressured to then sign up. This obviously, if it works to recruit 20,000 people a month this way, then it gives the Russian enough resupply in personnel while keeping the pressure away from the Russian population. The New York Times has written an article about the losses of life inside of Ukraine, and the numbers they give is that the Russian military has probably lost 120,000 dead and 170 to 180,000 injured, while the Ukrainians have lost 70,000 dead and 100 to 120,000 wounded in the same time. This is somewhat in accordance to other numbers. Like recently, some reports were that the Ukrainians need to recruit 10,000 fresh recruits per month, which would more or less adjust to those numbers if you account that a certain amount of people are being killed and being wounded, and some have taken captures and being returned. And if you add that up, the monthly death ratio on the Ukrainian side, you probably come to roughly 70,000 a month in this way. So in total, 500,000 casualties from the militaries and almost 200,000 dead soldiers in the war so far. And Russia is also planning to introduce laws that will ban in all of Russia the publication of military information, so taking pictures of positions, etc. And also the mentioning what the Ukrainians have attacked would be illegal, as well as showing the aftermath. This is actually a logical conclusion, because right now, unless the Ukrainians somehow get aid from the Americans with satellite pictures or anything, if they send their drone for an attack there and the drone crashes into the target, they have no clue how much damage they actually did. But so far, the Russians were usually happy to help them by taking pictures and videos of the aftermath, for instance, of the attacks on Moscow. So Ukrainian military intelligence could assess the damage, could assess whether they need additional strikes or whether these strikes so far have been sufficient, and Russia wants to address this by making it a crime in the future. We have some more news about international aid as well. Germany is sending 2 more IRIS-T SLS launchers, 4,359 rounds of DM-125. Those are smoke shells for the 155. They're also sending 10 ground surveillance radar of the type Ground Observer 12. And Ukrainian president has talked to Zelensky was speaking to the Swedish prime minister, and they agreed that Sweden will help Ukraine build CV90s in Ukraine. So supposedly Ukraine will soon start the production, or at least in the future start the production of the Swedish CV90 IFV. Ukrainians are also getting training on the Archer artillery system. That is superior, highly modern artillery system developed by Sweden, where the artillery piece is more or less autonomous and the crew is just in the cabin of the wheeled chassis. And the fire rate is so high that it can, I think it was a five shot salvo, it can fire and already drive away before the first shell even hits the target. Ukraine supposedly will then receive those, otherwise they have not. Otherwise, it wouldn't make sense to deliver them. I'm not completely sure. There were some rumors that they had delivered some in the past. Yes, from the reports I just checked, there were claims that Ukraine will receive some later, but as of now, I don't see any confirmation that they had already received Archers. And the interesting part is that Ukrainian pilots, according to Zelensky, are already testing the Gripen, which only makes sense if Gripen will be delivered to Ukraine in the future, maybe even including production runs inside of Ukraine, where Ukraine has some has had an aircraft industry. So we'll have to see what develops there, but apparently Sweden is committed to aiding Ukraine significantly achieving its goals. That was it for me for today. I feel kind of distracted, so I hope it wasn't too horrible what I did today, but if you liked it, please hit the thumbs up to help with the algorithm. Leave a comment what do you think about the article from the Washington Post about the Ukrainian counteroffensive. And if you're new here, I would like to invite you to subscribe to the channel and hit the bell icon so you don't miss future videos. This channel is only possible because of the support of viewers like you. If you'd like to support the channel, you can do so by the means in the description. Thank you very much for supporting me so far. And that's it from me for now. Thank you for watching, and I'll be back.